No Creed, don't try it. We know he killed Cadia, but this just isn't the way. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're going to be putting one of the scariest characters in all of 40k through his paces, and staging a short fight between Abaddon and each one of the faction leaders for every army in 40k. I made a very similar video a few months back for the Avatar versus everyone, and since the Chaos Codex came out, I've had rather a lot of people ask me to make a similar one for the Despoiler, and put him through his paces against the various Primarchs, Demons and Xenos deities, and see who comes out on top. As with the last one, this is mainly meant to be a damage contest for fun. It doesn't really show whether one model is more competitive than the other or not, though I must admit Abaddon is pretty amazing. Having a basic mathed out one-on-one fight doesn't really account for the movement of the models, their buffs, and any supporting fire or other units about, but it is still pretty iconic to see which of these characters can triumph in single combat. For his opponents, he'll be going against every single faction commander in Warhammer 40k. Most of the armies in the game at least have some sort of de facto leader, and for the other factions I've gone for one of their 5-tier special characters, though there aren't any obvious choices for Harlequins, Chaos Knights or Genestealer Cult. In general, I've just tried to keep it to the faction leaders, though due to how many requests I got for a fight with the Nightbringer when we made the Avatar video, I've also included him alongside the Silent King. The rules for the contest are fairly simple. Each model gets one psychic phase, one shooting phase, and one fight phase, and they see how much damage they can cause to the other model. We then tot up the percentage damage caused compared with the other model's wounds characteristic, and the one with the greatest percentage total overall will win. Abaddon does have some pretty crazy defensive rules, including a flat 3 cap on wounds for each phase, and a Mark of Tzeentch which can turn off 1 damage inflicted each turn. I'll admit I have used some very slightly rough and ready estimated maths for those, as calculating them exactly is incredibly difficult, but I'm happy that the figures are in the ballpark of being right and shouldn't be impacting the results. It does mean though that a lot of damage against Abaddon will average slightly less than 3 wounds, as 3 wounds is the maximum that he can take, and there is the chance of the enemy rolling low and not inflicting that amount. Otherwise for the contest we are keeping stratagems out of it, but the warlords will be getting their warlord traits and their chapter tactics and any army-wide special rules. For rules that vary turn on turn, I've said that if they have army-wide rules that can apply for 3 or more turns in the game, they can make use of them. I have given Abaddon Wanton Slaughter for this, as he could be affected by it for the majority of the game, even if it is the last 3 turns. If you want to work out his damage out of Wanton Slaughter, then you basically take 16% off the melee damage for Dracnian. Otherwise, I'll also calculate the points ratio for each fight to see whether or not the characters are doing well against Abaddon for his points cost. It should at least help out the characters a little bit who cost a fair few less points. First up, let's run through Abaddon's many abilities, and meet the guy who's going to be cutting his way through most of the heroes of 40k. Here is his stat line, special abilities, and some of the ways that it's changed since his previous data sheet in the last Chaos Codex. Abaddon's a 300 point HQ choice for Black Legion. He is a Supreme Commander for Chaos, and he is an infantry model with a 6-inch move, hits on 2s, strength and toughness 6, 9 wounds, 8 attacks, leadership 11, a 2+ save and a 4+ invul, and armor of contempt to worsen enemies' AP. It's a pretty mighty stat line, very tough indeed, and even his attacks are a little bit better than they appear, as one of his warlord traits gives him +1 attack all the time, or plus D3 attacks if he happens to be in combat with Imperium. For his war gear, he has the Talon of Horus, 4 shots at 24 inches, strength 5, AP -1 and damage 2. Not normally going to be enormously meaningful for trying to chew through enemy characters, but certainly doesn't hurt too much, and Dracnian for strength 9, AP 4, damage 3, and wound rolls of 6 cause D3 mortal wounds. Combine that with 9 or 10 attacks, and all of his reroll abilities below, and he's going to be getting quite a lot of stuff. Then we get into his many special rules. He's got Let the Galaxy Burn that will allow him to be in Wanton Slaughter, as he can get it for most of the game. The Mark of Chaos Ascendant will give him +1 strength on the first round of combat, so typically up to strength 10. The Mark of Nurgle gives him -1 to wound if he is hit by strength 6 or strength 12+ weapons, which is relevant in some of these matchups. Basically, he's only ever going to be wounded on a 3+ or a 5+ normally. And then he's got the Mark of Tzeentch as well, which means the first failed save each turn becomes damage 0. This is enormously powerful when you're fighting characters, as even just 1 failed save through can mean a lot of big damage, and it combos very powerfully with Dark Destiny as well, which means that he can't lose more than 3 wounds in a certain phase. Between Mark of Tzeentch and Dark Destiny, it means that almost any character in the game is usually not going to be able to kill him in a single round of combat, which is just enormously powerful. Finally, he's got a single unit buff that he can target himself with, and it basically allows him to reroll hit and wound rolls against his targets. It makes his shooting a lot more meaningful, but on Dracnian it's just monstrous, hitting usually 35 out of every 36 times, exploding 6s due to wanton slaughter, and then wounding most things on the game 8 out of every 9 times with some mortals on 6s. It's not for nothing that he has basically the reputation of one of the strongest characters in the game. So let's put the Despoiler through his paces then, and our first challenger is the Avenging Sun himself, Rabute Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, and a 300-point Supreme Commander for the Imperium. He's got a stat line that mirrors Abaddon's in quite a few ways, strength and toughness 6. He has a 3+ invul save though from the Armour of Fate, and on a 4+ he gets back up when he dies with d6 wounds remaining. The Emperor's Sword is actually fairly similar profile to Abaddon's Dracnian, strength 8, AP -4 and damage 3 with some mortal wounds on 6s as well. He doesn't get quite as many crazy rerolls as Abaddon though, and doesn't have the damage cap at 3 wounds per phase. Getting into the fight, the Talon of Horus averages less than a wound against Guilliman. Armour of Contempt helps with this, so he's still saving on a 2+, and Dracnian goes into bat with an extra d3 attacks versus Imperium, and does 10.4 wounds after the 3+ save, and another 4.1 wounds to chase it down. It means that with average rolling, Abaddon kills Guilliman at least fairly reliably, and then he's got a 4+ chance to resurrect on d6 wounds remaining. Accounting for the chance of failure for that, that's adding in an extra 1.75 wounds after he's taken his full 9. Overall, that's just over 7 wounds dealt to Guilliman overall, who may or may not be standing up on a few wounds remaining, so 81% damage. With Guilliman's strike back though, he just can't muster anywhere near that amount. The Hand of Dominion shooting averages 0.3 failed saves to Abaddon, though with the Mark of Tzeentch that usually means that that's going to be negated to 0, and the only chance of doing damage that he has is if he gets 2 hits through in the shooting phase, which is a very low chance and a very small amount of wounds dealt on average. The Emperor's Sword is far better though in combat, averaging 2.2 failed saves, plus an average of 2.3 mortal wounds. It roundabout maths out to 2.7 wounds out of the 3, accounting for the chance of not dealing quite enough. Overall, it's 30% damage to Abaddon and 81% to Guilliman, and as for the same points cost, it grants a 270% victory to Abaddon per point. It seems that Chaos really is an ascendancy when we're fighting Abaddon versus the Imperium Supreme Commander. Maybe Guilliman will be in a line for a tune-up, something similar to Abaddon, when the next version of the Ultramarines Codex comes out. Next up we have Morvenn Vahl, the High Abbess of the Sisters of Battle. She's in a raised up Paragon Warsuit, 280 points, hitting on 2s, strength and toughness 5, 8 wounds and 5 attacks, has a fair bit of shooting with Paragon missiles and her heavy bolter Fidelis, and then strikes with the Lance of Illumination in the fight phase. Quite a helpful profile at damage 3 and some extra mortal wounds. Her Warlord trait will allow her to reroll all hits and wounds in combat. She halves damage and has a shrug off against mortal wounds as well. If she survives to the end of the fight phase, then she can fight again, though that isn't particularly guaranteed when Abaddon is around. When it comes to combat, the Talon of Horus is even less relevant against her due to her -1 damage, though it does wound her a tiny bit easier as she's only toughness 5. Again, Dracnian is pretty savage with an extra d3 attacks versus the Imperium. She's a little bit less tough than Guilliman and doesn't have the 3+ invul, though halving damage and the 4+ shrug off against mortal wounds means that the output is kind of similar, and she doesn't have the chance to resurrect. Overall, he'd deal well over her maximum damage, 13.7 wounds of her 8, so 171% damage dealt on average. In return, Fidelis isn't likely to cause all that much saves, it's only wounding on 5s due to the Mark of Nurgle, and then only around a 1% chance to deal 2 wounds to him due to the Mark of Tzeentch. The Paragon missiles with their full rerolls are a bit more reliable, only about half a failed save on average, though accounting for Fidelis doing well and chipping a wound, or multiple Paragon missiles going through. If one does hit home, it hits big, though it does have a small chance of doing so. On average, her shooting phase will get you around about 0.4 wounds. Realistically, it's either 3 or nothing, but it's nothing quite a lot of the time. In melee, the Lance of Illumination really is quite reliable. She's had at least a reasonable chance to chip away the Mark of Tzeentch in the shooting phase, and with a full reroll, she actually causes slightly more failed saves than Guilliman, plus the 1.1 mortal wounds on 6s. She averages 2.8 wounds dealt, and between that and shooting, she actually does very slightly better than Guilliman, 3.2 wounds out of 9 for 36% damage. She does have a small chance of living to fight again, but it's not going to be very meaningful, seeing as she can only do another 0.2 wounds in the fight phase at best. Overall, she does slightly more damage, but due to having no resurrect mechanic like Guilliman, she actually does worse per point. When waiting for her 280 points, Abaddon gets a 444% victory. Trajan's next up to the plate, the High Commander of the Adeptus Custodes. He's gone up to 200 points in the recent update, though he is still a bit of a beast both in melee and in terms of his buffs and moment shackle. His strength and toughness 5, 8 wounds and 6 attacks, and seeing as he can be part of a shield host, I've put him in the Emperor's Chosen. I think that's likely to be one of the most common picks that he'd be using typically in game. His Watcher's Axe gives him a small shooting attack, but some fairly hefty melee at strength 10, AP 3, damage 3. He's got a 5+ feel no pain, and the moment shackle will allow him to do one of 3 powerful abilities, fighting again at the end of the fight phase, ignoring a failed save, or interrupting. When Abaddon attacks, the Talon of Horus on average does 1.3 wounds. As Custodes players will be painfully aware, he doesn't get Armour of Contempt, so it does a bit better against him. Then Dracnian does a fairly similar amount of damage to Vahl and Guilliman, 12.4 wounds overall, and Trajann will use the moment shackle to ignore a failed save, as he's not likely to live to fight a second time in the fight phase. It only saves him 2 wounds off that total, as that's how many Dracnian will normally do after Feel No Pain. Overall, he deals 11.6 wounds compared with Trajann's starting of 8, so 145% damage there. When Trajann swings back, unfortunately it is rather underwhelming. The Watcher's Axe is really quite unlikely to be chipping off anything in the shooting phase, will only average a failed save 1 out of 10 times to chip Mark of Tzeentch, and without any rerolls to wound in melee, he doesn't actually get that many attacks through. He only averages about 1.7 failed saves, one of which will be taken away by Tzeentch, so after there's a Mark of Tzeentch and the chance to roll low, he only deals 1.8 wounds on average, due to him often failing to inflict the 3 that he needs to in the fight phase. Overall, it's not great for the Captain General. It's 145% plays 20%, giving Abaddon a 483% victory. Kaldor Draigo's next, and Abaddon's first psychic opponent. Only strength and toughness 4, so actually weaker than the rest of the models that have come so far, but still hits really quite heftily in combat at strength 8 and damage 3, plus both has a mastercrafted Storm Bolter and can cast 2 psychic powers at him, and has a 3+ invul save as well. As Grey Knights, they have a 5+ feel no pain against mortal wounds, which does help out a bit, and with his Demon Slayer Warlord trait he'll also get an extra attack on the charge, which also does help as he counters charging in this contest. All this adds up to Draigo being more resilient than most, taking just over 1 wound from the Talon of Horus, and only 10 wounds combined including the mortals after the Grey Knights feel no pain. Unfortunately, only having 7 wounds, he is still dead, at taking around about 11 wounds compared with his 7, 155% damage overall. In return, at least Draigo does have the option to try for 3 phases of damage, though unfortunately that mastercrafted Storm Bolter isn't going to be getting far against Armour of Contempt and Toughness 6. On the other hand though, he can pack both Smite and Vortex of Doom in the Psychic phase. Accounting for chance of failure of both, he'll average around about 2.5 mortal wounds out of 3, just for the chance that he fails to cast either Psychic power and doesn't do the 3. In melee it's fairly similar. The Titan Sword is a pretty good profile for taking out Abaddon, and with the small chance of having chipped a wound in shooting, it averages about 2.5 wounds, dealing 5 wounds out of 9 to Abaddon, the best performance so far with 55% damage. Don't get me wrong, it's still a very big win to Abaddon, but it's made a little bit less so due to the points weighting. 300 versus 180 means an 169% victory to Abaddon, by far the closest contender so far for the Imperium. Next up, Belisarius Cawl will try his hand. I must admit things aren't looking amazing for Mr. Tech Priest, as he isn't a top melee combatant, though at least he's respectably tough with 8 wounds and -1 damage, and does have a fairly powerful shooting attack in the Solar Atomizer. Abaddon basically does his usual against Cawl, just under 1 wound with the Talon, and around 12 to 13 wounds with Dracnian, again quite handily killing Cawl with 166% damage dealt. In return, the Solar Atomizer is actually quite a good profile for shooting into Abaddon, decent strength AP and flat 3 damage. It averages 0.62 failed saves towards trying to break the Mark of Tzeentch, and for the chance of rolling high and getting 2 saves punched through, he does have a small chance to inflict some damage, and does 0.24 wounds for the small chance of Cawl converting 2 failed saving throws out of the gun. Otherwise, in combat, Cawl will strike first with his 2d6 Mechatendrite attacks. They won't do much, but still have the chance to do some damage if Mark of Tzeentch has already been broken, plus stack even more damage towards breaking the Mark of Tzeentch for his Omniscient Axe. Unfortunately, the axe isn't particularly standout, only damage 2 and AP -2, and even with multiple combined numbers, Cawl doesn't look too great, only 1.65 wounds against Abaddon, the worst performance so far bar Mr. Creeeed, and it does work out as a 553% victory to Abaddon, or 166 versus 18% damage if you're just going one model compares with one model. Let's bring some bigger muscle now, and for the Imperial Knights we have Canis Rex, the only Imperial Knight special character, and his raw stats aren't bad even as Knights are concerned. He hits on 2s, has strength and toughness 8 with 24 wounds and 5 attacks, though he does only have a 3+ save in defense, and quite importantly no invul save in combat, which is going to hurt him big. He does pack some pretty hefty weapons though, a multi-laser and a las impulsor for shooting. The las impulsor has some pretty high damage, and then Freedom's Hand in melee hitting on 2s should hurt Abaddon pretty hard. It seems that the sweep attack is actually optimal to be going into Abaddon, attacking at strength 10, AP 2 and damage 3 with extra mortals on 6s. On top of that he gets a single reroll per turn, and has a Chainbreaker special rule for exploding 6s to hit against non-Imperium units. Overall pretty hefty, and if he dies Sir Hector can get out to get roundly killed next turn. Unfortunately for our knightly challenger, Canis Rex does seem to be a pretty ideal target for Abaddon to deal big damage against. The Talon of Horus with the rerolls chips a little bit, and Dracnium with the 10 attacks and exploding 6s will convert the vast majority of those hits, and then convert just about every wound anyway, wounding 8 out of 9 times, and then further mortals on top of that. Overall he winds up with a pretty ridiculous almost 34 wounds out of 24, and again around an 140% damage, kind of similar to what he was doing to the other faction commanders. To be fair, with his powerful shooting, Canis Rex does hit back at least fairly hard. The multi-laser's worth firing first to see if it can break the mark of Tzeentch, and then the las impulsor will deal just over 1 failed save on average. Usually that means that's just going to get caught on the mark of Tzeentch and the damage go away, but for the chance that you get multiple wounds with a las impulsor or you chip something with the multi-laser, it does average almost a wound. In melee, Freedom's Hand is really quite reliable though. Mark of Tzeentch is likely to be gone by this point, and the sweep mode will stack a whole bunch of saves plus some mortal wounds, and Canis averages 3.7 wounds out of 9 or 41% damage. I guess theoretically when Canis is destroyed we could have another round of combat with Abaddon absolutely wailing on Sir Hector, but I think by that point the battle is a bit of a foregone conclusion. Overall it's 140% damage plays 41, and if you wait for points it only gets worse in Canis' favour seeing as Abaddon's far cheaper, a 458% victory. So it seems that the Imperials really can't hold a candle to the Despoiler, and it does seem that we're going to have to rely on Xenos and Chaos Beasties to try and take him down. First up, and a great performer against the Avatar in our last one, we have Be'lakor, 380 points worth of Demon Undivided, and kind of the demonic mirror to Abaddon leading the Chaos Demons faction. He hits on 2s and strikes at strength 12, AP 4, damage D3 plus 3 with the Blade of Shadows, which also cuts straight through invul saves, though Armour of Contempt still does hamper it a bit. On the defensive, he's really not bad either, can't reroll hits against him, and it's -1 to hit, even though Abaddon does kind of counter that with Black Legion, as he gets +1 to hit against the closest target. Then he gets a couple of psychic powers from the Noctic discipline, which does have a few nasty tricks. Damage-wise, the Talon of Horus is still fairly consistent, he is -1 to wound, so only wounding on 6s, but Be'lakor's poor save at range doesn't help him against that either. Otherwise, in melee, Abaddon actually does fairly well against Be'lakor. His Black Legion +1 to hit on the charge comes into effect. The no reroll hits helps, but other than that 4+ invul save, Be'lakor doesn't have any feel no pain or negative damage reduction, so every hit that goes through hurts a lot, and the mortals hit very hard. Overall though, he's one of the few models that Abaddon does struggle somewhat to kill, only just slightly dealing over his average wound count, 103% damage against the Dark Master. In return, Be'lakor gets to strike with both Psychic and the Blade of Shadows. Smite, including the chance of failure, averages 1.8 wounds, and then it seems that the best other choice is Betraying Shades. Really helps Be'lakor get towards maxing his 3 wound cap in the Psychic phase. I did run the numbers for Penumbral Curse to reduce Abaddon's wound roll, but it seems that they're almost exactly the same. Betraying Shades works out slightly better percentage-wise, compared with Abaddon reducing his wound roll by 1 as he still gets 4 wound rerolls. Then in melee, the Blade of Shadows goes into bat pretty hard, 2.6 failed saves on average, averaging 2.7 wounds in total, due to the chance of a spiking saves, and also not having any other attacks that have had a chance to chip away the mark of Tzeentch. Ignoring invul saves does help quite a bit though, as Abaddon's only saving on 5s from this due to the Armour of Contempt. Overall though, for damage against the Despoiler, Be'lakor is the single biggest performer so far, 5.4 wounds out of 9 and 60% damage, though still a fair bit behind the Despoiler himself. Points-wise though, things aren't great in Be'lakor's favour. He's at 380 points, and the Despoiler is 300, so a 217% victory to Abaddon. Next up we have arguably the greatest challenge on the list, Mortarion is 450 points, deals damage on 3 different phases, and is really quite focused rules-wise on being a both very heavy damage dealing and defensive character. The Primarch of the Death Guard is no slouch in damage or defense. Toughness-wise, he's Toughness 8, has a 4+ Invul, a 5+ Feel No Pain, and -1 damage. In addition, he also gets the Host of Plagues rule, allowing him to pick a debuff aura, and as the Glowing Bloat seems to be the most common pick for Mortarion competitively, we'll give that to him. It is really quite relevant, seeing as it turns off Abaddon's rerolls outright. If there's anyone who's going to be able to shrug off that crazy amount of damage that Abaddon puts out, then this guy's one of the best contenders. Otherwise, for damage, he's got a single-shot Lantern Pistol, a couple of Psychic casts, a flurry of weak attacks with the attendant's Claws and Teeth, followed up by the mighty Plague weapon Silence, any save of which is just going to cleave straight through Abaddon's defences. Overall, it's a pretty mighty stack of abilities to rival Abaddon's own. In combat, the Glowing Bloat does bite hard, no rerolls for Abaddon, cuts damage both with the Talon and Dracnian. Typically for the shooting attacks, I usually assume that the characters are just within 12-inch range. The Talon of Horus only manages a paltry 0.3 wounds, -1 damage and a 5+ Feel No Pain, wounding on 5s make it fairly redundant. And then in combat, Dracnian's hitting far weaker than it virtually ever has before. Fewer hits with no rerolls, much fewer wounds with no rerolls on a 3 to wound. And after failing those 4+ Invuls, -1 damage and Feel No Pain, you average about 4 wounds from Dracnian itself, and an extra 2 wounds for the mortal wound output. He's totaling 6.3 wounds out of 18, or 35% damage overall. Next up is the Death Guard Primarch's Time to Hit Back. The first Psychic Power choice, Smite, is a bit of a no-brainer, averaging 1.8 wounds. Though basically looking through the entire Death Guard discipline, pretty much all the other powers are useless. The -1 to hit gets cancelled out by the Black Legion trait, and the mortal wound ones are fairly bad into Abaddon. I decided to go for Plague Wind at the end, just for a very small extra amount of mortal wounds. In shooting, it's not actually possible for the Lantern to cause any damage due to the Mark of Tzeentch, but it has basically a third chance to break it. The attendants all strike first to again try and break the Mark of Tzeentch before Silence gets to work, and his Great Scythe averages a pretty decent amount of damage. You've had at least a reasonable chance to break the Tzeentch mark already, and you're likely to inflict 2 or 3 wounds with Silence anyway, giving you a pretty good chance of hitting that 3 cap. Overall, it's 4.8 wounds of 9 to Abaddon in total, so Mortarion wins this round, 53% damage to 35. Even accounting for points, at Mortarion's slightly lower points cost, it's 450 versus 300, so this is just a very narrow defeat for Abaddon per point. When waiting for the damage differential, it's only 99% to Mortarion's 100. Finally, we have a challenger that can bring down the Despoiler. Next up, let's take a look at the other Demon Primarch. Magnus the Red of the Thousand Suns dropped down to 420 points recently, and again he's got a multifaceted stat line with bunches of special rules. He is a fair bit easier to kill than Mortarion, unfortunately. It's Toughness 7 and a 4+ Invul save, but only -1 damage. His Psychic Mastery is pretty much second to none though. He's got the choice of the vast majority of psychic powers through the Thousand Suns Codex, and cast speeds different powers per turn with almost 100% reliability between a cumulative +3 to cast and re-rolling. On top of that, the Blade of Magnus is pretty useful, 2x strength, AP -4 and damage 3, so if you do get a wound through that isn't negated by the Tzeentch mark, Abaddon will be taking the full 3 wounds. In combat, with access to his rerolls again and no 5+ Feel No Pain in play, Abaddon does increase his damage output once more. The Talon of Horus doesn't do loads, but Dracnian does around 9 wounds plus another 4 from the mortals, dealing 14 wounds of 18 in total. For Magnus hitting back, his numbers are very good. In the Psychic phase, he may as well just cast Doombolt alone. You're almost 100% likely just to deal the flat 3 wounds then and there. +3 to cast with rerolls means that the chance of failure is minuscule. For the other 2 powers, I thought we'd just try and make the combat phase damage as reliable as possible. Swelled by the Warp for +1 attack, and Twist of Fate to remove Abaddon's Invul, so they'll only be saving on a 5+. Then with those 2 buffs in play, he's got 9 attacks ignoring Invuls with flat 3 damage. Even after the Tzeentch mark negating one of the wounds, it's almost certain to punch through 3, and it's a total of 5.9 wounds out of 9. Still though, despite having basically maxed out 2 different phases of damage, it's only 66% compared with Abaddon's 78, and Magnus does cost significantly more than Abaddon as well at 420 versus 300, which furthers the Despoiler's lead. Basically, if you're not able to hold off at least 2/3 of Abaddon's damage, then you're unlikely to beat him unless you can damage him in all 3 phases and damage him well. Moving on, let's see what the forces of the Xenos can muster against him, and we'll start off with the Swarmlord's profile with the more relatively new Tyranids Codex. This guy's a 240 point Hive Tyrant, is fairly mighty with strength and toughness of 8, a big 13 wounds and a 2+ save, and his blade parry in combat is pretty meaningful, meaning the first failed saving throw goes to damage 0. The Bone Sabers are at least fairly good for chewing through Abaddon's save, a big 9 attacks at AP 4 and damage 3. And he's got 2 rather helpful psychic powers as well. One of them can cast Smite, the other one makes sense to cast Catalyst for 5+ Feel No Pain, as that drastically reduces the damage output coming in on the Swarmlord. Seeing as he can have a Hive Fleet, I thought we'd make him Hive Fleet Leviathan. That'll give him transhuman physiology to lessen Abaddon's damage further, and also a single reroll. Defensively, the Swarmlord does hold out really quite well against Abaddon. The Talon of Horus does a little bit, and I have counted in the chance of the Swarmlord casting Catalyst for the 5+ Feel No Pain in these numbers. In melee, the Swarmlord's got rather a lot of advantages going forward. Transhuman physiology from Leviathan means it only wounded on 4s, ignores 1 failed save with blade parry, has a 4+ invul, and also has the chance for the 5+ Feel No Pain with Catalyst. Rather a lot of nice buffs there. It winds up as only 6.4 damage from Draconian standard damage, though the mortal wounds aren't as badly affected, just under 4. Overall, it's 11 of 13 to the Despoiler. Perhaps not outstanding compared with a lot of the other similar weight characters who has fought so far. In return, the Swarmlord's used one of his casts for Catalyst and goes for Smite for the other, 1.8 mortal wounds in the psychic phase, and then the Bone Sabers are a very good profile for dealing with Abaddon in combat. He averages 2.9 failed saves, including the single Leviathan reroll, and even after the Tzeentch and the chance of Abaddon spiking high, that's still around 2.8 wounds dealt on average. Overall, it's 4.6 wounds of 9, so a fairly close win for the Despoiler here. 84% plays 51, which when you wait for points only goes down to 131% victory for Abaddon. The Swarmlord's certainly one of the better performers so far. Next up, let's take a look at last time's contender in the Avatar of Khaine. In the last contest, I'll admit he didn't have all that much trouble dealing with Abaddon, fairly handily running him through with a massive amount of melee damage. D6 plus 2 damage when the Wailing Doom strikes is really rather good if you don't have a mechanic to cap damage. Otherwise, he's really durable with toughness 8, 14 wounds and a 2+ save. He halves damage, has a single melter style shooting attack, and of course a huge amount of combat damage. When it gets to the fight, in the previous one, Abaddon only managed 5 wounds of 14. Here though, he's going to be doing a lot better. Even after the half damage mechanic, Draconian still goes in at around 9.3 wounds, and the mortal wounds are particularly effective against the Avatar, up to 4.6 there. Overall, it's just slightly enough to average a dead Avatar, 104% damage dealt. On the other side though, the Whale of Doom doesn't even particularly wound or break saves reliably, so a small chance to beat the mark of Tzeentch there. And while the Wailing Doom has absolutely massive damage if it does get a save through, no rerolls to hit and wounds does mean that it's a little bit less reliable than some at getting the full 3 damage, and you might well just roll low or Abaddon spike his saves. Overall it equates to around a 2.6 wounds out of 9, so it's 29% damage plays 104%. The tables have turned pretty mightily between this pair. On the previous contest the Avatar beats Abaddon by 104 to 35, and now Abaddon's beating the Avatar by 104 to 29. So he's thrashing him even harder than he got thrashed last time. The points differential weighs very slightly in the Avatar's favour, but it's still not a good look, a 334% victory for Abaddon overall. Basically, if you don't deal multi-phase damage reliably, you're not going to get very far against Abaddon the Despoiler. Next up for the Drukhari, I thought we'd go for Drazhar. Not really the faction leader, as we don't have any rules for Vect, but he'll do in a pinch. He's a very strong single combatant for 145 points. The Executioner's Demiclave strike with strength 6, AP 3, damage 3, and he gets +1 to wound and reroll his and wounds from the Warlord trait. On the defense, he's got a 4+ invul and -1 damage, there are only 6 wounds going round, so he is going to be less of a challenge for Abaddon to kill than many. The Talon of Horus chips a little bit, though not so much against -1 damage, but Draconian is pretty similarly efficient as he is against most characters, averaging 15.3 wounds out of a meager 6, so on average kills Drazhar roughly 2 or 3 times over. In combat, Drazhar is one of the most likely ones to punch through the full 3 wounds in the fight phase, fighting twice with rerolls to hit and wound, +1 to wound and a flat 3 damage, pretty much guarantees him the 3 wounds, though obviously that's going to be nowhere near enough. Overall, its 255 plays 33%, and even waiting for points with Drazhar costing half as much, that's still over a 300% victory to Abaddon. Next on the chopping block we have Commander Farsight. In the last contest we used Shadow Sun, but I thought we'd honour the Enclaves as our favourite Tau faction in this contest, particularly as Farsight's got an interesting Dawn Blade to deal a bit of combat phase damage. In general, he's not particularly got exciting stats defensive wise, a shield generator for a 4+ save, and fires with a high intensity plasma rifle at 2 shots at strength 8 damage 3, and the Dawn Blade for a bunch of damage 3 attacks in combat. Abaddon has less trouble cutting through Farsight than virtually most of the other combatants he's seen so far, coolly killing him around about 3 times over on average. Even the Talon of Horus is pretty effective when he's only got a 3+ save and no -1 damage or anything. To be fair to him, Farsight does put in at least some effort in return fire. 2 shots with a high intensity plasma rifle has at least a reasonable chance of breaking the mark of Tzeentch, and a very small chance of punching through 2 unsaved wounds, netting you around about 0.3 wounds on average for the shooting phase. In combat, the Dawn Blade isn't particularly reliable, but you have already had a pretty decent chance to break the mark of Tzeentch, so it doesn't do too badly. 2.7 wounds overall, or about 30% damage plays 300. A pretty monstrous victory for Abaddon there, but maybe Tau being forced into a single combat fight isn't exactly their strong point. Let's up the ante for a bit and look at the Necrons with the Silent King followed by the Nightbringer. The Silent King is perhaps one of the hottest models to be hitting the table at the moment, 400 points now, and as the overlord of the Necrons in general, he's got a whole lot of things going on. On the defense, he's got 26 wounds, 5 of which are contained in the Menhirs that float alongside him for protection, a 4+ Imbal save, and it's quite a lot to chew through for any one character. Then he's a very multi-threat piece in both the shooting and the fight phase. In the shooting phase he's got those enormous Menhir Annihilator beams, and a bit of shooting with the various different Staffs of Light for Zarek and the Triarch. Then in combat each of the Triarch will hit pretty hard as well. 13 attacks in total, split between the Staff of Stars, Scythe of Dust, and Zarek's own weapon. On top of that, as a core model now, he gets all his own rerolls to hit at range and to wound in combat, and then Living Metal for a bit of regeneration. Lots of range and melee threat, and plenty of durability too. With Abaddon's attacks, he can deal some fairly efficient damage here. The Talon of Horus isn't too bad, dealing over 2 wounds on average, and then Dracnian doesn't have any -1 damage or feel no pain or things to deal with, so it does go in fairly strong, 14 wounds from Dracnian, a couple of which will be lost due to Menhir overkill, and then a few mortal wounds as well. Overall, it equates to 18 wounds of 26, or a solid 69% damage there, though the Silent King will remain alive, or at least as alive as he ever gets. Then with an absolute ton of fairly high quality attacks coming in at Abaddon, they are pretty good at negating the Tzeentch save and making it not as important. The Staff of Stars has a bunch of attacks to fire first, so hopefully tip it off there. Even with -1 to wound, it still has a bunch of saves failed. Then I'd fire with the Sceptre of Eternal Glory for a chance of 2 damage, then those twin Menhir Annihilator beams, which if they punch a wound through, then they get the full 3 damage just then and there. Overall, it's around about 2.6 wounds from the shooting phase, and then we repeat the process again with the Staff of Stars, Sceptre of Glory, and the Scythe of Dust in combat. He's very likely to score the max amount of wounds in combat, 2.9 in total. Overall, it's 5.5 wounds out of 9 on Abaddon, 61% damage, and only very narrowly losing the fight. Certainly one of the closest challengers yet, though when waiting for points, Abaddon does still win handily, 150% efficiency compared with Zarek if you do take into account the points differential. Next though, not a faction commander, but one that I'm sure that everyone would have been asking for if I didn't include it, is giving the Catan charge of the Nightbringer a pop at the big boy. The Nightbringer really does have a pretty handy profile for dealing with Abaddon. He looks like a fairly natural counter, and he does feel like he's very much giving the Despoiler a taste of his own medicine and then even more. His 320 points after the points changes, hits on 2s with strength and toughness 7, 6 attacks and a 4+ Imbal save. Though like Abaddon he is one of the characters that can only take a certain amount of wounds every turn due to that Necrodermis, and then will heal a wound on his own turn. His Scythe of the Nightbringer though is perhaps one of the single best weapons for killing stats characters like Abaddon. It's strength 14, AP 4 and damage d6, which is a great start, but it has 2 amazing special rules, ignoring Imbal saves to start with, and also ignoring any rules that cause enemy models to ignore wounds, so Abaddon's cap of 3 wounds per phase for once won't apply here. As well as that, he's also got multi-phase damage with the powers of the Catan. The Nightbringer's Gaze of Death is a particularly vicious one. In combat, Abaddon really isn't going to like having a taste of his own medicine. The Talon of Horus does put in some fairly decent work, only toughness 7 and a 4+ Imbal does mean that it's got a pretty good chance of hitting that 3 cap. It averages out to around about 1.8 wounds. Then Dracnian goes into bat, a crazy amount of damage, almost certain to be hitting the 3 wound cap, but as the Nightbringer can't take more than this, there it will stay. Overall it's 4.8 wounds out of 9, and then the Nightbringer heals a wound every second player turn. Seeing as we've only really represented one player turn here, I thought it would be fairest to have him regenerate half a wound. Overall, after that, the Despoiler's only got 48% damage against the Nightbringer, the lowest count of any bar Mortarion. In return though, the Nightbringer hits back with more damage than any other characters managed to muster. The Catan powers are pretty excellent for maxing out damage earlier in the turn. Antimatter Meteor and Gaze of Death both have a really high chance to get to that 3 mortal wounds on the Despoiler. The chance of both of them failing to do so is very small indeed. It averages out to be 2.9 mortal wounds. Then in melee, the Nightbringer does manage to get through the 3 cap. Armour of Contempt still does quite well to shield Abaddon from some harm, and the Mark of Tzeentch does nullify the first of the failed saves, but still 1.2 saves go through on average, and deals 4.3 wounds in total to the Despoiler. In total, it's 7.2 wounds out of 9, giving us our second victor out of all the characters of 40k so far. The Nightbringer does cost a few more points, but it still winds up being Abaddon's greatest defeat per point so far, 64% efficiency against the Nightbringer. As you would have guessed on paper, the Nightbringer does seem to be a very solid counter. Finally, last but not least, we have the greatest war boss in the galaxy, Ghazghkull Thraka. 300 points worth of enormous orc. He'll be shooting with 16 shots with Mork's Roar, though admittedly the vast majority will miss. He'll be far better in melee with Gork's Claw at strength 14, AP 4 and damage 4, and is fairly durable to return damage, toughness 7, a 2+ save and a 4+ invul, and again one of those reduced damage rules so he can only take 4 wounds maximum per turn. He also gets an extra attack and exploding 6s for being Goths, which will make his melee that bit more reliable. Damage wise, Abaddon actually averages slightly less versus Ghazghkull than he does against the Nightbringer, slightly more in terms of raw wounds, though less percentage wise due to Ghazghkull having more wounds himself, a small chance to slip something through in the shooting phase with the Talon of Horus, and then a very high chance to max out the 4 wounds with Dracnian between all of those damage 3 attacks and mortal wounds, 44% damage overall on the Grand War Boss. Unfortunately though, Ghazghkull's profile just isn't all that strong against Abaddon. Mork's Roar only has a small chance to chip a failed save due to Armour of Contempt and being a measly ballistic skill 5, and then Ghazghkull actually has surprisingly few attacks in melee for a very scary war boss, who average 2 failed saves, and with Mark of Tzeentch it means that you're not all that reliable to punch through the damage. It's 2.6 wounds on average. Overall it's 44% plays 28, and as they cost the exact same points, it's an 157% victory for Abaddon, though admittedly even with those numbers Ghazghkull does do better than most. His damage cap really comes into play here. So with Ghazghkull cast down, that just about brings us to the end of Abaddon cleaving his way through the vast majority of the faction leaders of Warhammer 40k. Victory wise, it seems that Abaddon has the upper hand against the vast majority of characters in the game. Only the Nightbringer and Mortarion managed to outright beat him, and both of those do so on a per point basis as well. Otherwise, for close contenders, the Silent King was very close on raw damage but costs a lot more, and Magnus and the Swarmlord are both kind of similar as well. Otherwise, the multi-phase damage thing and not fighting into big monstrous creatures means that he absolutely destroys things like Guilliman or Morvenn Vahl. These ones tend to do fairly well on fighting comparisons normally. Basically, to perform well for the points against Abaddon, you need multi-phase damage and some pretty powerful defensive tricks of your own. Towards the bottom of the list, we've actually got Canis Rex, Trajann Valoris, Cawl and Creeeeed. Creeeeed effectively getting beaten something around 140 times over, I think. But was he really beaten? If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep some regular 40k videos coming. They usually tend to be a bit more sensible and focused to how armies play in game, but every so often it's fun just to smash some characters against each other. Finally, if you have been enjoying videos like this, or would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description below. The Patreon page is what allows me to keep on making videos like this. Big long ones with lots of maths do take a lot of time and effort, so if you are enjoying quite a bit, then any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few things, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and actually in hindsight it does turn out that Creeeeed wins after all. He is a tactical genius, So of course he had 3 Nemesis Dread Knights hiding just off the side of the screen. Good job Mr. Creed for enlisting allies with multiple phases of damage. You can't go in unprepared when you're trying to avenge the fall of Cadia after all. A massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.